Hello, everyone. My name is Toghrul. I do research at Scroll. And today we're going to be talking about rollups, specifically how to spot a rollup. So imagine you're Chris from the second generation of Pokemon games, and it's a playable character there. And your task is to pick a rollup. And as anyone who played a Pokemon game even once, they know that it's quite difficult to pick the right starter. Do you go with the looks, or the stats, or the properties? And the looks means that you choose whether it's cool or cute, the Pokemon that you choose, and stats you go a bit more analytical and think what will be what will be the starter that will benefit you the most when you go through the game. So if you go through the looks, a bunch of cool logos, a bunch of cool UIs, everything looks cool, but how do you pick the right one? This is a chart from L2Beat, specifically the risk section of L2Beat, and you can see a lot of yellow and red here. And that's not good. That means that these protocols, these protocols are not actually rollups. They are what Vitalik calls proto-rollups. So they are at a stage where they are slowly becoming compliant with what the majority would agree is a definition of a rollup, but they currently are not compliant with all the requirements. So let's define what a rollup is. A rollup is an off-chain protocol that inherits the following security properties from the underlying base layer. One, data availability. And what's data availability? Data availability is the process of making the data available to anyone willing to download it for some predetermined amount of time, usually a few months or a month. And note that you shouldn't confuse data availability problem with the data storage problem. The data storage problem is the process of making the data available for you to download forever. Second property that is also very important is censorship resistance. And censorship resistance is quite difficult to define. And I'm not going to go very technical into the definition of censorship resistance now because I'm just going to bore you to death. But let's just define censorship resistance for the sake of this exercise as a process within which, within some predefined period of time, the protocol guarantees that the user-generated transaction will be included. So in this case, that would be if a user submits a transaction to an L1, an L2, the L1 guarantees that that transaction will be included within some time. Let's say 24 hours, for example. And another important property is ordering. So what is ordering? Ordering is the process of guaranteeing that a certain sequence X is finalized once the underlying layer finalizes it. So in this case, for example, if you have a batch of transactions and you commit them to the L1, and as soon as the L1 finalizes that transaction order, you can no longer revert it. So that's universally agreed upon ordering. So unless something really catastrophic happens on the L1, you basically have to accept that that's the canonical ordering. Another property that is important is validity. Though note that in here, validity means that we need to make an additional assumption. So in case of an optimistic rollup, you need to assume that there is one honest node that is capable to challenge a state commitment. So essentially, let's say if somebody submits a batch with an incorrect state commitment, another person who's also running an L2 node has to spot it and then challenge that state commitment on chain. And for zero-knowledge rollups, the assumption is a bit different. You just need to assume that the zero-knowledge proof system that you use is actually functioning correctly. So let's say if you're using Graph16 or Halo2, you just need to assume that the system that you're using, so in this case, Graph16, is functioning as intended and it's not broken. And validity is the process of making sure that the execution is compliant with the state transition function defined by the protocol. So in this case, we ensure compliance either through fraud proofs or zero knowledge proofs, depending on the specific rollup. And another property is temporary bridge immutability. So what does temporary bridge immutability mean? It's when an initiated bridge upgrade actually allows users ample time to exit in case there's something that they disagree with. So unfortunately for now, it's difficult to imagine that general purpose rollups are gonna be ossified, or we could make the contracts immutable for the foreseeable future. And so there's going to be some form of upgradability, either through governance or some form of security council or something like that. And we need to make sure that the user who doesn't agree with the upgrade, so for example, there's a malicious code being injected, like for example, what happened with Tornado Cash the other day, there's always a way for that user to exit prior to that change being enacted. So Vitalik in his article defines the time required as 28 days. I usually say that it's around a month. So let's say 4 weeks is more than enough for the majority of the users to exit if something is wrong with the upgrade. And finally, we have permissionless liveness recovery. So what that means is, in a lot of cases, a rollup will adopt its own consensus mechanism. So for example, it will run BFT or some form of other consensus mechanism that will basically allow it to have faster confirmation times than the underlying layer. But the disadvantage of that in a lot of cases, those consensus mechanisms are permissioned. So for example, if you use Tendermint, you can only have a few hundred validators participating in the consensus. And what happens if that consensus fails? So there's a liveness failure. And if you don't have any way to recover, it's essentially stuck, and you need to use some form of upgradability or something like that to recover, which is not a great option. And so the rollup should have a fallback path. So if you were referred to the consensus path as the happy path, the rollup should also have a happy path that allows anyone to commit blocks or batches to the underlying layer if no batches were committed by the consensus within a certain amount of time, let's say an hour or 2 or whatever. It really depends on the specific implementation. So now that we got through all the properties, this is the only rollup on L2B that actually complies with those, with the definitions that I listed below before. Unfortunately, it's not a general purpose rollup, so it's a payment rollup, so you can only transfer money from one person to another, and also it has $8 of TVL on it, so not a lot of people use it. And while everybody else, including us at Scroll, we're trying to improve the security properties, etc., it still will take some time before all of us can be compliant with the current definition of a rollup. And so for now, we're all stuck with some form of safety precautions or some form of multi-sigs, which will make us, I think Vitalik uses type 0 and type 1 training wheels, so we are essentially proto-rollups. And a bit of a side quest here, we're also gonna bust some myths. So you noticed how I never mentioned centralization when defining what a rollup is. And you might rightfully ask, but what about centralized sequencers? But in reality, centralized sequencer is a UX problem in a rollup. It's not a safety problem. So because the underlying base layer provides us with the guarantees of correctness, we don't really rely on the sequencer for that. We just need the sequencer to provide some form of real-time censorship guarantees, censorship resistance guarantees, because even with censorship resistant, a centralized sequencer is unable to censor us permanently. It can only do it temporarily. So the centralized sequencer orders some stronger real-time censorship resistance guarantees, and that's it. And basically, the reason why using a consensus makes sense for rollups is because it's just easy, and it's the easiest way you can decentralize. There are obviously other ways you can decentralize. For example, Justin Drake has this proposal of using searchers to create bundles and basically have the same properties as the L1, but there are also downsides there. So it's just picking whatever works best for you. And another myth that I've been seeing a lot on Twitter recently is that an L2 with a sovereign consensus mechanism basically is just another L1, which is also completely not true and nonsensical. And the reason why it's not true is because, as I previously said, the rollup just doesn't provide separate safety guarantees, correctness guarantees, etc., etc. So when you think about an L1 consensus provides certain guarantees. So it offers ordering guarantees as well as DA and validity guarantees for light clients, whereas a rollup consensus doesn't do that. It's just used to provide better real-time censorship guarantees, and that's it. And therefore, the reason why we use consensus, some of us will use consensus mechanisms and rollups is not the same reason why you would use a consensus mechanism for an L1. The reasons are completely different. Yeah, thanks for listening. It's been a bit of a short talk, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask.